All right, welcome everybody. I don't need to introduce myself because I think y'all know who I am. I'll be talking about the historical reliability of the New Testament, and I promise the subject will be much less dry than the title implies. A couple questions we want to consider. First one, if we're going to even be here, the question we want to ask is, does it even really matter whether or not the Bible is historically reliable? Second one is, if it does, how can we determine if the documents in the New Testament or any historical documents are reliable or not? What are the tests we use to do that, or the criteria? And then I'm actually going to quiz the audience at the end of looking at some common objections and how we might respond to them. So let's start with the first question. Does historicity really matter? I argue it's yes, because Christianity is not anchored in what your parents taught you. It's not anchored in what your culture taught you. It's not anchored in what you're feeling at the moment. It's anchored in an historical event, specifically the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And Paul puts it very clearly and very bluntly in his first letter to the Corinthians, where he starts off with the basis of it all. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me. So Paul is appealing to historical facts as the basis for all of this. Then on top of that, he then says, he goes through the implications of whether or not this is true. And the same letter, starting verse 13, but if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. So it does matter. It's not merely a feeling. It's not a passing out tradition that Christianity is anchored in historical events, and that means the anchor is only as good as the historical reliability of those events. And in our case, our primary source material for the historical events, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, are the New Testament. But this happened 2,000 years ago, thousands of miles away from here. So how can we know what really happened? We don't have anybody's Facebook accounts or Polaroid pictures or whatever. So the first question we had to ask ourselves is, we do have written accounts, and the New Testament purports to be a written account of the events. So the first question we have, can we trust it? Can we trust that what was written in the original Testament is a reliable record of what happened? And there's three factors we want to look at when looking at this or any account of any historical event. The first is knowledge. Did the author have access to the information? Was it possible for them to actually know what they say that they knew? For instance, if I say that, someone grew a plaid rose in Austin, Texas, first question you need to ask is, could I have even known that? Have I ever been to Austin? Do I know anybody in Austin? How would I, is it even possible for me to have access to the information, period? Second part is integrity. Can the author be trusted to tell the truth? So can they be trusted to know the truth? And that's knowledge. And then integrity, can they be trusted to tell the truth even if they do know it? And then the third is consistency. Are the accounts that we have consistent with whatever other information we have? And this is how things work in a court of law. When you have people testify in a court of law, they're always witnesses who by definition were there. You don't have somebody who's, Aunt Martha's sisters-in-law's, next door neighbor's dog said so and so. You have the people there who should have who should have firsthand information of what happened. Or you can have expert witnesses who may not be witnesses to the events, but they have the expertise to help put the pieces together. But you don't bring in people who just don't know anything about the event. And I said integrity. They make you put your hand in the Bible. I don't know if they still do that. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And then you don't just bring in one person and make the whole case there. You look at various pieces of information. You bring in multiple witnesses. You look at corroborating information and say, do all of these pieces of information point in the same direction, or are there inconsistencies? So this isn't something special that we do with just historical documents or the New Testament. This is how we do things in a court of law. This is how we try to establish who did or didn't do what. But in our case, we have an extra piece in the mix because, and we'll talk about this more later, is that we don't have the original documents. So then the other question we have to ask is, how can we know whether or not the copies that we have are the same as what was originally written down? So the first question we have to ask ourselves is the knowledge questions. Could the New Testament authors actually have knowledge of what happened? Now, again, as I said, in the case of in the case of anywhere, eyewitnesses have the most direct knowledge of any event because they were actually there. And probably most of you young to remember, the whole eyewitness news shtick, that it's not, we're not getting our news from secondhand sources. We sent our cameras and we sent our, crew and everything to actually see this event and bring it to you direct. So you're not getting some kind of a filtered or modified version of it. And all of the authors of the Gospels and of the books of the New Testaments either saw the resurrected Jesus or they were closely associated with people who had. So Matthew's Gospel, Matthew was one of the apostles. He's mentioned in Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. In Mark and Luke's Gospel, he's referred to by the name of Levi. A lot of times people had a Greek name and a Hebrew name. Mark traveled with Peter, according to the testimony of the early church. Luke traveled extensively with Paul, and when you see starting in Acts verse 16, Luke is part of that we. He was a he had a firsthand knowledge of a lot of the things that happened in the gospel in the book of Acts. But he also, like I said, traveled with Paul, and he indicates at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke that he did a lot of research. So he probably sourced other eyewitnesses in the process of compiling the material that made the Gospel of Luke. And John the Apostle, not as opposed to John the Baptist, John the Apostle was the apostle whom Jesus loved. And John also refers in his own epistle to being an eyewitness of these things. And again, not second-hand knowledge. So the internal evidence would say that yes, these gospel writers and the early church unanimously testified that these are the people who actually wrote the Gospels and therefore either were eyewitnesses to the events or had direct access to those who were eyewitnesses of the events. So I think we can answer affirmatively to the first, is that could the New Testament authors have had access to the information that is direct access to the information that's contained in the Gospels? I believe the answer is yes. Well, that's fine. Witnesses lie. Happens all the time. So the second question we have to ask is, would the authors of the New Testament have told the truth about what they saw? Now, one thing we have to keep in mind when we study history, the authors of ancient documents are always given the benefit of the doubt unless you have good reason not to believe them. Partly because if you assume they're all lying, you are not going to get anywhere because you don't have anything else to start with. So you always give them the benefit of the doubt. Doesn't mean you just take your word for everything. There's some instances where we know that people are clearly playing hard and fast with the truth. But there's also a couple things we want to consider when we're looking at ancient documents. One is that the closer you are to where these claimed events happen, the easier it is to get caught if you lie. If I want to lie about something that happened in Pago Pago 100 years ago, it's going to be very hard to get caught in that. On the other hand, if I lie about something that supposedly happened on the University of Maryland campus yesterday, there's an awful lot of people who can either say, yeah, that happened, or no, that didn't happen. Jesus was crucified and resurrected, according to the Gospels, in Jerusalem. And where did the early church start? Jerusalem. It's going to be very hard to pull that one off if you're making this up. Also works with time, that the closer you are in time to an event, the harder it is, the easier it is to get caught in a lie. And we see right in the beginning of the book of Acts, within weeks of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that Peter is already publicly claiming in Jerusalem that these things happened. Again, not the smartest move if you're lying through your teeth, because there are plenty of people there who could debunk this. If you want to make up something about that happened, before anybody in your audience was alive, or again in some place that none of them ever had access to. That kind of a lie you might get away with. But a lie that's that close in time and space, very hard to do. And then the late 50s, so about 25 years after the event, Paul was talking to a Roman official and referred to the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection as public knowledge. And says it did this when he was with a Roman official in Caesarea, so about 55 miles from Jerusalem. And there's no indication that anybody who was in the room thought that Paul was lying. He had the guts to say that, they said this stuff didn't happen in a corner, was the phrase that he used for it. So, and Peter, and Paul later wrote the letter to the Corinthians that we saw quoted earlier. Now, granted, Corinth is in Greece, it's farther away than Caesarea, but Paul's saying again that many of the resurrection witnesses were still alive. This is not a smart thing to do if, in fact, that there are people who can disprove if there are people around who can disprove what you're saying. There's also the other question that you can ask is, okay, what if the Gospels, how long a period was it between when the Gospels were written down or between the actual events when the Gospels were written down? Is there a possibility that somewhere in that time period things, legends popped up or elaborations started happening, things like that? But the problem is that there's a lot of internal evidence that the Gospels themselves were written down while many of the people who were involved in the events were still alive. For instance, the narrative in Acts ends around 62 AD with Paul in Rome under house arrest. If Acts was written later, why did it stop there? I mean, Paul's martyrdom 4 years later would have been a pretty seminal event. And Paul was pretty much like the headliner for the entire second half of Acts. I mean, Peter once the focus shifted away from Jerusalem, you hear very little mention of Peter. But the whole thing is about Paul and Paul's ministry. So you would think that if Paul had been martyred before Acts was written, that would have been included. But it's not. Furthermore, Luke states Luke was written before Acts, because Luke in Acts 1 verse 1 refers to his first book being the book of Acts. They're both written to the same audience, some guy named Theophilus, which we don't know if it was a formal name or a title. And on top of that, a lot of people consider the Gospel of Mark to be one of the sources used for the Gospel of Luke, because there's a lot of common material between Mark's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, which would make Mark even earlier than Luke, and Luke is earlier than Acts. And then Matthew and Luke and themselves have a lot of common material that's not found in Mark. It may belong to an earlier written source. Q is the term that's given to it. The problem is we have no actual copies of it, so it's entirely speculative. But the point is that we're pointing to source material that is well within the lifetimes of the people who were involved. And the apostles were probably preaching this material in various forms for a couple decades before they wrote it down. Why did it take so long to write it down? There have been speculations about that. One possibility is that the apostles thought that Jesus was going to come back soon, and so they didn't need to make a written record of it. Paul was writing letters to the churches to encourage them, and they were preaching the life and times of Christ when they were out planting churches, but they may not have seen the need for a actual written record until some of the apostles started being martyred, and they realized, wait, if we don't write this down, we need to do that. And there's another part, which I think is a very big piece of evidence for an early dating for the New Testament. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. But the New Testament never, ever, ever makes mention of it. And all of the Gospels refer to Jerusalem in the present tense. When you see John giving his description thing, it's always there is his, this is here, this is there. Now, some people could, some people ask, why should we expect the Gospels to? Well, first of all, why would we expect the Gospels to mention, or to not mention? Why should we expect the Gospels to mention the destruction of Jerusalem if they were written afterward? I mean, it's a relevant point. Just because A happened after B doesn't mean that I have to mention A. That I necessarily have to mention it. There are things that happen later that aren't necessarily relevant. Because when you read a book about a history, if a history book is written, say, in 1985. There's going to be a bunch of stuff that happened before 1985 that's not going to be mentioned in it just because it's not relevant. But we have to think about what the destruction of Jerusalem meant, first of all. What was its meaning to the Jews? And remember, the initial gospel accounts were all written by Jews. This is a watershed moment in Israel's history. The temple, which was their center of worship, was destroyed, razed to the ground. Israel ceased to exist as a political entity. I mean, they hadn't been an independent, they were under Roman dominion before then, but the Romans had given them a pretty good amount of freedom as far as self-governance. And that was over. The total dead may have been in the hundreds of thousands. We don't know for sure. Josephus claims over 1 million. There are other people who push back on Josephus' claim because they don't think that the population of all of Palestine was that high. We don't know for sure. We know it was higher than the population of Jerusalem than the normal population of Jerusalem, because when the Romans were basically conquering their way north through Palestine, they would see, as they approached towns, people would run out of their towns to Jerusalem because Jerusalem had much better walls. They thought that was a safe haven. So Jerusalem was quite packed by the time the siege began there. The other thing is, even if you don't buy that, they would have mentioned something that was that traumatic in the history of the people, of the history of the Jews. The other thing is, Jesus predicted it. In Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, Jesus openly and clearly predicted that the temple was going to be destroyed and that the city of Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. So if you wrote the Gospels were written down after they happened, why would you give up a golden opportunity to show that he was right? And furthermore, if the Gospels were written after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the predictions that Jesus made were made up in order to go with history, why did they also throw in, if they made this up, these references to Jesus' second coming, which obviously didn't happen then? Because when you read any of those accounts, it seems like he's going to come back right after the destruction of Jerusalem. Why create all this confusion if you're making all this stuff up? I think the most logical conclusion is that this was all written, that when this was all written down, the temple had not been destroyed yet. That the gospel records were already in existence, before 70 AD. Another part is the book of Hebrews is absolutely irrelevant that there's no temple. There's no point in writing it, because the whole point of the book of Hebrews is to encourage Jews who had converted to Christianity to not go back to temple worship. And he goes into these long, things about why Christ is superior to temple worship and what the temple worship signified and what it did and all stuff. If there's no temple worship because there's no more temple, why would you bother? That doesn't make any. The book of Hebrews, the whole thing doesn't make any sense in a world where there is no temple. So the point of making it all is to show that, again, there's very strong evidence internally that the Gospels were in fact written during the lifetimes of the potential witnesses, and that meant there wasn't enough time to get this accretion of legendary type stuff, and that the existence of witness would have provided a corrective if anybody did decide to get hard and fast with the truth. But then there's another big one, which is, when we ask, would the New Testament authors have told the truth? Why wouldn't they? Because think about it. What could a group of otherwise ordinary Jewish men possibly have gained by starting a new religious system that in a lot of ways was a repudiation of the religious system they grew up with? Now, when I'm saying repudiation, I'm not talking about a repudiation of the Old Testament law. What I'm talking about is a repudiation of all of the accretions that have been placed on it by the Pharisees. All of the additional things that have been added to it. Why would they do this? What would they gain out of it? I mean, normally when we think about it, there's only three things that people, generally motivate people: money, power, and I can't say the third because this was being recorded, but we all know what it is. Money? No, these guys were destitute. Power? these? No. I mean, if anything, what did they actually gain? Persecution and ultimately for many of them, martyrdom. As for the third one, I'll leave that to your imagination, but I don't think that really got them anything either. So the question is, who would suffer and die for something they knew what was a lie? I mean, people often will cite, the 9/11 hijackers, yes, but they didn't know that that was a lie. They believed that they were acting in accordance with the truth. A lot of people have died for what they thought was true. But whoever suffered and died for something that they knew was a lie? So to me, the stronger argument is not, why would they have told the truth? Is why wouldn't they have told the truth, given the price that they paid for it? Because again, they could have, everything could have been perfectly fine had they recanted. They could have gone back to life as normal, and they chose not to do that. So the last part is consistency. Is how consistent is the testimony we have with other sources of information? And what we have, everything that's recorded about Jesus in historical accounts, the records that we have from the time, is consistent with the New Testament accounts, with a couple caveats. One is there's not a whole lot of material to work with. I remember reading, I think in one of Josh McDowell's books, that the entire corpus of everything that we have from the decade after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection would fit on the single shelf of your average bookshelf. Be about 4 foot long. And most of that material would have no reason to mention Jesus. In the case of the 4 foot long, some things were stuff like cookbooks, gardening tools, stuff that's, descriptions of birds, things that you wouldn't expect to mention Jesus. So we're already starting with a very small body of work that's actually been preserved over 2,000 years. And then of that, you have to question, okay, of those things, what are things that would even be relevant to mention Jesus? And mostly it's histories. I mean, by people like Josephus, for instance, and Pliny. The second was we're not going to find corroboration for the supernatural events in the New Testament. I mean, these books were written by people who were not Christians. They didn't have any reason to believe that that Jesus was the Messiah, that was true. Now, somebody in the Middle Ages apparently decided to play some games with Josephus's account and threw some extra stuff in there to try to indicate that Jesus was the Messiah and perform miracles. But there's pretty strong textual evidence that was a forgery. That Josephus did mention Jesus, but that what he mentioned, that he didn't have all this elaborate, flavorful stuff for it. But there's no indication whatsoever, when people try to make the argument, he's entirely fictional figure, there's no historical evidence for that. Why would these other authors, who had no interest at all in mentioning Jesus other than historical, why would they mention somebody who they even suspected was not a historical figure? Another aspect to think about is not just consistency with the details of the story, but with the background, with the environment. When you see, for instance, especially in the Book of Acts. Sorry about that. I did last time too. When you see the Book of Acts, and you see all the descriptions about geography of we went here, we saw this person was in charge of that person was in charge of the other thing. It's incredibly detailed. And it's also incredibly accurate. And now you may say, it's like I said again, and that matters. Because if you get the historical setting wrong, then the likelihood that you got the details wrong is pretty high. If you're not going to get the right, for instance, in the Book of Mormon, if you've got a lot of the details about these civilizations in the Western Hemisphere and other things that don't jibe with any other records we have, if I'm going to have a difficult time believing all those historical details, I'm going to have, I have even more of a difficult time believing if you're going to start making supernatural claims in the middle of all that. And we have to remember, it's easy for us to think in our 21st century terms because we have, our phones and we're plugged into information about everything, everywhere, at any time. The New Testament authors didn't have that. Where are they going to get this stuff? If someone's going to, where is somebody who's writing in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th century going to get this incredibly detailed information about geography, about politics, about weather, and so on, if they're from a different place. They can't just look the stuff up on Google. So I think the fact that the New Testament documents have such a rich historical context and such an accurate one, it doesn't prove the supernatural parts, I grant it, but it gives you a lot of credibility. Because the fact that Luke and the others get their historical facts right gives, that's I'm going to pay attention to that. Whereas again, if we knew that if the historical facts are a bunch of bunko, or if there were no historical facts, then why should I believe them? So this is actually going to be participatory. Looking at this first part of what the New Testament authors have told the truth. Remember, there are three parts of this: knowledge, integrity, and consistency. So can someone summarize for me the knowledge part? What do we mean by knowledge, and why does it matter in our effort to find out whether they're telling the truth? You don't need to raise your hand. There are few enough here, just go ahead and talk. If there were 40 people here, I'd tell people to raise their hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it pertains to what the authors have, or do we have reason to believe that they would know what they're writing about? Are they just making stuff up, or do we actually think that they could possibly know what they're writing about? And it matters because, if they don't have any possible way of knowing, like say the Gospels were written by some guy in China in the 400s, right? Then we can just discount it, ignore it, because it's not relevant at all. But if they do have reason to know what's going on, well then that makes their testimony at least that bit more compelling.
Exactly. Having that knowledge is critical. As I said, in a court of law, you work with eyewitnesses, not hearsay. You try to get people, to the extent you can, you try to get people who actually were actually involved in the event, because you know that they're going to have firsthand relevant knowledge. So, and you already alluded to a little bit of detail. So what can we say about what the New Testament authors could have known about the events they wrote about? Everybody's going to stare at TJ and make him uncomfortable.
No, I'm looking at the other two.
Oh.
I mean, they were contemporaries. They were like eyewitnesses, or they were very closely associated with people who were eyewitnesses. Like you mentioned, Paul and Luke traveling together. So it's, they were there.
Exactly.
They saw it.
They saw it, or they worked with people who had, or they were very closely associated with people who had. Exactly. We have all the reason in the world to believe. And again, it's not just in the Gospels. There are other places also where there are appeals to eyewitnesses. John starts his first epistle, which we've seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched. They're claiming to have firsthand knowledge of these things. So for integrity, in this context, what do we mean by integrity, and why does it matter when determining whether or not the authors are telling the truth?
It's really just, can we believe that what they said is what happened?
Mm-hmm.
And if we can't, then what they said doesn't matter.
Exactly.
And if we can, then we should actually see whether what they said makes sense.
Yep. And what can give us confidence that they were telling the truth?
Two of the major things you mentioned were proximity of time and distance from the events that actually happened.
Yep.
Because if I'm in the same place that something happened 500 years later, or if I'm 100 miles away 20 years later, no one is going to know what happened at that point, because none of them are going to be at the time or the place that I'm at.
Exactly. If I on church on Sunday claim that in this room at 7:36 p.m. I pulled a rabbit out of my back pocket of my jeans, a bunch of people right here could say whether or not that was true. Whereas if on church I announce that I did this while I was on a trip to State College, Pennsylvania 15 years ago, so the big difference. So that proximity really matters. And he said that's what we have with the New Testament authors. There's very strong evidence that the gospel, that the written records came into existence early enough for the original, for those who were there to have made a comment, to be able to correct it if they played hard and fast the rules. And again, even Paul basically dared people to do that. He said 500 are still living. 500 people saw it. Most of them are still living. He said you don't do that unless you're telling. Well, I shouldn't say you don't do it. It's an incredibly stupid strategy if you're lying. And then consistency. In this case, what do we mean by consistency?
I guess whether like the New Testament authors' letters were consistent with like other sources. I'm sure they could be secular and they might not attest to the supernatural happenings. However, like the fact that they even talk about Jesus, like that's something.
Oh yeah. I mean, think about the fact that, again, Josephus, Pliny, and others, I mean, they're really going to talk about some itinerant carpenter preacher in, a little hole in the wall like Palestine. Might be something there.
I'd also add on that, one thing that is not focused on a lot is also extra biblical Christian testimony to these events. Particularly First Clement, because I think a good case can be made for that document to have been written in the 60s itself. Mm-hmm. So it is remarkably early, confirming a lot of New Testament stuff. And then we have the rest of the Apostolic Fathers written from this range of 60 to 110 AD. So that's pretty earlier than Pliny's letters.
Absolutely. And we're actually going to move on to you. That's a great introduction to the next section. How do I turn this back onto the? Sorry. Because the next question we've got to ask is, can we trust that we have what they wrote down? And what you just said, Aditya, is a big part of it. Because again, we don't have the original New Testament manuscripts. Wish we did. We don't. We have copies. And probably we have copies of copies of copies, not even first-generation copies. And they're not machine-made copies. No one took a picture of it with their iPhone or stuck it through a Xerox or whatever. They were done the old-fashioned way. But again, first thing we got to remember, that's true of everything from antiquity. So all of the documents that we use to know about the history of Rome, the history of Greece, the history of Babylon, the history of China, the history of all of these ancient civilizations were under the same constraints. We don't have the originals of what people wrote down. We have copies of them. So we've got to ask ourselves the question, how true are the copies we have to the originals? Because, we're human beings. We make mistakes. How do we know? Or, people have made arguments that there was deliberate alteration. So how do we know? And the answer is, two questions we want to ask. How old are our oldest copies? The idea here is that the earlier the copies are, the closer they are in time to the originals. So in other words, the fewer generations copy-wise they're removed from the originals, the less time or opportunity there is to make changes. Intentional changes or accidental changes. That the earlier you are, the earlier copies, the less opportunity that there is for either intended or unintended messing around with the record. We also ask, how many independent copies do we have? In other words, copies that aren't just aren't all copies of the same copy, but that are copies of different copies, and we find in different places, different locations, made out of different materials. And again, the idea here is the more independent copies we have, the harder it is to hide changes that were, again, real ones or not real ones, that were deliberate ones or accidental ones. And it's also easier to determine the contents of the original. And I'll illustrate that in a little bit. First, we'll ask a question. How old are our earliest copies of the New Testament? Earliest copy that we have that's undisputed is called the Ryland's Library Papyrus P52. There's a picture of it, which actually the picture on the computer is not much bigger than the actual size. It's like this big. But it was found in Egypt, and it contains parts of the 18th chapter of John's Gospel. So it's like about first half of the second century. Around the end of the 2nd century, we've got early portions of we've got most of John's Gospel in what's called the Bodmer Papyrus P66, and then the Chester Beatty Papyrus collection, but they've got parts of the Gospels, parts of Acts, and Paul's epistles. The earliest complete or nearly complete Bibles that we have are Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, which are from the mid-4th century AD. And you're probably thinking, my goodness, that's hundreds of years. A lot of shenanigans could have taken place here. But a couple things to keep in mind. First is that for other ancient texts, we're typically talking about a gap of 1,000 years or more. So if we're just going to make an argument solely on the amount of time, if anything, the New Testament stands up way better than anything else that we have in antiquity. Doesn't guarantee anything, but we'll get to that. In addition, as was pointed out, we also have quotations from the New Testament author, from the New Testament books from the Church Fathers. Some of them as as early as the late 1st century, early 2nd century. Now I'm putting quotations in quotation marks because we have a couple caveats. One is there were no chapters or verses in the Bible at that time. So it wasn't like Clement was saying, in chapter 8, verse 3 of Paul's letter to the Romans, he says such and such. And even when you look at, so part of us understanding that there were no chapters and verses. The other part, which is also critical, is that quotations in that time and culture weren't always about getting exact quotes. The focus at that point in time was to capture the idea, not necessarily capture the precise words. And that's why whenever in your New Testament, when you see little references to New Testament, the tiny little footnote and everything, and sometimes there's confusion over that because they're not word for word quotations, especially in the Psalms. A lot of times it's not 100%. I can't say with absolute lockdown certainty that this was what was intended. So we have to keep that in mind, that what we think of a quotation, we think now quoting scripture of chapter and verse and getting the exact letters. That's not what's happening here. But we have enough there and enough of where we feel highly confident in the quotations that we could reconstruct most of the New Testament, even if we had none of the New Testament manuscripts. Now, to be fair, we don't have the original manuscripts of the Church Fathers writing either. But we know roughly when they were alive and when they must have written what they've written. Now, you could try to expand the conspiracy theory and say that somebody later on made those up too, but I would argue Occam's razor. It's a whole lot simpler to just assume that the authors are actually who the authors were rather than somebody came up with this incredibly elaborate, complex ruse centuries later. So the other part is number of manuscripts, because again, the more manuscripts you have, the more difficult it is to hide changes, because you basically got to, if you're going to make wholesale changes to the document and you want to cover your tracks, you've got to destroy all of the other copies that had the stuff you don't want and make sure, this is not an easy thing to do. And again, the number of copies helps. If you have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of copies, then the likelihood that you're going to have at least some copies that have weird variants in them is going to be really high. If I've only got 5 copies of a document, from 2,000 years ago, there's a pretty high probability that somebody could have very well had a completely different document somewhere that just disappeared. Problem in our case, well, not problem, it's a solution. We have over 10,000 full or partial New Testament manuscripts in multiple languages from a wide geographic area, i.e. around the entire Roman Empire, which again, if they're on one geographic area, there's a greater chance of shenanigans where somebody, where the church or whoever could basically rewrite them, destroy the old copies, be done with that. It's a lot more difficult when you've got copies sprouting from all over the place. And for comparison, that 10,000 figure is about 25 times higher than any other work from antiquity. So again, if you're going to, on basis of manuscript evidence alone, if you're going to try to make an argument that the New Testament hasn't been reliably transmitted, then you've got some answering to do, because then why should I believe anything that came out of antiquity when the manuscript evidence is way better for the New Testament than it is for any of these other documents? So again, why does it matter? Because the more of these documents we have, the more copies we have, the more more confidence we have that we know what was in the original. Now, you'll say that's a problem, and if Bart Ehrman were in the audience, he would jump down my throat at this point, because most of the copies don't agree with each other, and sometimes the disagreements are significant. Does the end of Mark belong in there or not? I don't think it does. And actually, I preached a sermon a couple years ago when we were finishing up Mark, and instead of preaching on the end of Mark, I preached on this very topic of biblical transmission, how it works. The woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. Does that belong in there or no? Earliest manuscripts don't have it. One manuscript of Luke has it. So should we start, quaking our boots or what? Well, a couple things to consider. 99% of the textual variants in the New Testament are obvious and or they don't have any bearing on the meaning of the text. And if you want an example, for those of us who live in the age of Google searches, you know what I mean. Most of it's just obvious. That's like, you did not mean this, but in Google's case, I'm going to be polite and I'm going to humor you, but it's pretty stinking obvious you couldn't have possibly meant what you actually typed there. Out of 20,000 lines in the New Testament written text, there are only 40 of them that are in dispute, and the vast majority of them are ones I talked about. The John in the woman caught in adultery, and then the ending of Mark. None of these have any bearing on any major points of theology. The historicity of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, or significance, is not going to get lost if we decided once and for all that those two passages weren't actually in the New Testament. So how do we try to figure this out? Because they still got that 1% where they can be more significant. How do we figure this out? And there's a couple ways to do it. I'm not going to go into huge details, but just to give you a basic primer of textual criticism. One is called majority text, where you literally just gather all the texts and you look at all the variants, and whichever version the majority of the texts has, that's what you say must have been the original. I have a question mark because I don't like majority text, and the reason is because there are other factors. The age of the manuscript copy you have. An older copy is going to be more likely to have a correct rendering than a newer copy, because there's been less time for mistakes and other things to creep in. Not always, but it's something that you want to consider. And then the other is the independence of the manuscript copies. If you find that there's a certain variant in the text that's always showing up if you got like 300 texts with it, but all of those texts are in the same geographic area from roughly the same time, and there's strong evidence that they all came from each other, then I wouldn't give that a whole lot of weight. But let's think about this from a more contemporary example. The telephone game. I know, people probably don't play the telephone game anymore. How many people have played the telephone game or are familiar with it? Okay, excellent. I don't need to explain the rules. But it's often used to argue that the text of Scripture was changed as was copied. But whenever you're going to say A is like B, or A is B, then the first thing you need to do is say, okay, in what ways are A and B similar, and what ways are they different? So let's look. So basically telephone game, one column, biblical transmission, the other. So the top row, information passing through many people, yeah, that's true in both cases. The telephone game, it's the whisper that goes down the line. In the case of manuscripts, it's person who receives manuscript, makes a copy, passes on, another person makes another copy, so on. Mode of communication is very different though, because the telephone game, you're speaking and you're whispering, because if you say it too loud, you're going to ruin, the other people are going to hear you and you're going to kind of blow the surprise. Whereas biblical transmission, it's written communication. There's much, the likelihood of getting something wrong that you heard in a whisper is way higher than the likelihood of getting something wrong that you read. Now, people still get stuff wrong that they've read. People who have seen my response to email know that it's very possible to completely read something wrong, but it's much less likely. Another difference in the telephone game, every participant has only what they were given by the previous person. That's it. They don't have access to the original. They don't have access to what the person 3 people ahead of them said. All they have is what got whispered in their ear. That's it. But we've got access to the whole McGill. We've got access to a number of copies going all the way back through time. We don't have just a single link in a chain that may or may not be good. And then think about the purpose of it. The purpose of a telephone game is to have fun. I mean, a lot of times you play telephone and you deliberately muck around with something because you want to make everybody laugh. But biblical transmission, it's not a game. You want the transmission to be as faithful as it possibly can be. So I would argue that, when people are saying it's like the telephone game, I'd say there's a similarity in terms of the passing on information through many hands, but that's where the similarity ends. I think it's a terrible analogy, and this is the reason why. Let's do another example from everyday life. Texting. And all of you have experienced things like this. So let's say that a friend of yours is texting you and they want to meet you at Vigilante Coffee at 7 a.m. on Tuesday. By the way, just full disclosure, this idea is borrowed/stolen from J. Warner Wallace. I think it's absolutely brilliant. So again, friend's going to text you, want to meet you at Vigilante Coffee, 7 a.m. on Tuesday. So let's say this person's having a bad day, or heaven forbid they're using voice to text. And first thing he gets this. Let's meet at Vigilante Coffee at 9 a.m. Tuesday. Okay, maybe, they're saying we should wait till 10 if I want to have my bagel with ham on it. Okay, that's fine. I don't know why they're telling me this, but that's fine. Okay. Let's meet at Vigilancia Coffee at 9 a.m. Tuesday. I have no idea where Vigilancia Coffee is, and Tuesday's got to be Tuesday, or else unless somebody decide to change the calendar on us. Les Feed at Vigilante Coffee, Fat 9 a.m. Tuesday. Okay. Is this something personal? Let's be at Vigilante Coffee at 9 p.m. Tuesday. Are there significant differences among these texts? Yeah. Would you still know what your friend is trying to tell you? I sure hope yes, because if not, none of us would ever get anything done via text. So the point is, variants themselves aren't bad. You can, especially if you have enough of them, you can get the idea of what's going on, because some mistakes are really obvious and others, you can kind of figure out pretty quickly from the context or whatever of what's really intended. So another one in pictorial terms is let's imagine, if we had copied the New Testament manuscripts in the way we show in the document, the way that we show on the screen. So we have the original manuscript, and just say for simplicity in this case, each person who copies makes 2 copies. They often made a lot more than 2. And what I've done is I've just put some colored dots or colored squares in here to indicate variants that are in the text. Anything from spelling errors to deliberate changes. So you go from your perfectly clean and white original manuscript to, by the time you're down to 5th generation or whatever, you've got a lot of variants. I mean, none of these 2 instances looks the same as the other one. But of course, we don't have all of this. We got this. Now the question is, and don't strain your eyes, just this is the concept, so don't try to actually figure out. Could we still figure out what the original text was, the white parts from this collection of copies? Yeah. Could we do it from this collection of copies? Still be a lot of white there. I think you could still do it. The point is, you don't have to have, we don't have to have the original autographs. It'd be nice to have them. But even if you've got, given the sheer number of copies we have, independent copies, different parts of the Roman Empire, so on and so forth, I think we can be very, very confident that we have what they wrote. Now, this raises a question that's brought up by a number of different people, including LDS, Muslims, and many atheists, that the New Testament record was significantly altered, and that the real record we have of the real record of Jesus was very different from what we have now. The problem is, in our case, of all the textual variants we have, and again, we got 10,000 manuscripts, we got, I can't remember, depending on how you count it, you can count like up to 2 million different textual variants. There are absolutely 0 surviving copies of the New Testament text that imply anything other than a divine Jesus who rose from the dead. So the question is, again, if the original autographs were that different from what we had now, what happened? How is it, because those were getting copied, How could none of them have survived? Again, they're getting copied. They're all finding things all over the Roman Empire. And again, people are like, oh, well, the church did this and the church did that. Like, the church was not, Christianity was illegal in Rome for the first couple centuries. There is no way they're going to suddenly do this incredibly organized effort to eradicate huge portions of biblical record and modify it. So basically, if someone's going to make the assertion that the New Testament has been significantly altered from the original autographs, I want evidence. I think there's plenty of evidence that happen. You're going to make an assertion like that, you've got to have evidence. You can't just say, "Oh, it was." And when you get these assertions, nobody, I've never had somebody who's been able to give me a good reason why I should actually believe that assertion. So, review time again. So the questions we have are: how old are our earliest? We're trying to figure out, can we trust that we have what they wrote? The questions we have: how old are our earliest copies, and how many copies do we have? So again, we'll do the Q&A part. So why does this matter? Why does the age of our earliest copies matter? Which one is it? Sorry. Okay. So why does the age of our earliest copies matter?
The earlier they are, the less opportunity there is for differences in transmission, corruptions, development, and changes in the text, and things like that. So generally, we hold a higher level of reliability for earlier manuscripts.
Exactly. Less time to mess around with things. And how does the New Testament stand up as far as the early part?
Well, our earliest partials are from 2nd century, so that's like less than 200 years after the events.
Less than 100, actually, yeah. Early 2nd century, yeah.
Early 2nd century, yeah. And our earliest full copies, I believe you said were from the 4th century?
Correct. We have earliest full copy of the entire New Testament.
Yes.
So we have whole books before then.
Yes.
Or at least substantial chunks of them. And again, these things weren't found in Jerusalem. They were found, like I said, the Rylands Papyrus was found in Egypt, which meant that probably had to have been copied over a few times already before it even got there. So the other question, how many copies do we have? Why does the number of copies matter?
Did you say like 10,000 copies or something?
Correct.
And which is actually a lot more than other historical texts.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, like the more copies we have, the more we can see what's in common, and yeah.
Yeah, if there are variants, then more copies we have, the greater likelihood that we're going to have. If there were changes, the more likely that we're going to have caught them. If we have lots and lots of independent copies, because again, otherwise, like if there were wholesale changes made, you would think that either some of the the documents that were in the pre-wholesale change era, either they would have survived or somebody would have cluelessly kept copying them because they didn't get the memo. And yet we see no evidence of that. And again, if we're going to make an argument that the New Testament wasn't accurately transmitted, then we have to say the same for everything that we have from that period of history, if we're going to use the same criteria. If we're going to look at how long between the original and the first copies we have, and how many, they said Roman history goes out the window, Greek history goes out the window, all of our history there goes out the window, because nothing is even close to the New Testament as far as the time gap between the events, the earliest manuscripts and or between the original autographs and the earliest copies, and the numbers we have. So, more quiz time. And this is my last slide, I promise. How might we answer the following objection? So someone's going to say we can't trust the New Testament accounts about Jesus because they're legends that evolved from fully human Jesus. So in other words, there are people, and this argument gets made, people write books and make tons of money off this stuff, that Jesus was in fact just an ordinary human, and that the New Testament accounts that basically they morphed from a human Jesus to that the divinity of Jesus and the bodily resurrection all are things that were added later on. How do we answer that objection? Or how might we answer it?
the chronology of the writing of the texts doesn't bear that out. The fact is that the earliest, essentially, the authorship of the text is too soon for legendary changes to have occurred.
Mhm.
Legendary legends essentially take centuries to form.
Exactly.
Not decades.
Yep. There wasn't enough time.
Yeah, and our earliest documents within the New Testament give this idea of, at the very least, some kind of divinity within Christ. Paul's epistles make note of it all the time. Before the Gospels are written, our earliest Gospels mention it. And on top of that, there is no tradition of just a human Jesus that's just it. There are other traditions of Jesus. There's Gnostic Jesuses, right?
Right.
But they're not just humans. There's something else.
Right.
And it's not until several centuries later that when these errors of just pure human Jesus start to come in.
Exactly. It's again, if someone's going to make an assertion that Jesus is other than the Jesus of the New Testament record, the first question you need to ask is, what's the evidence for that? Okay, so maybe it didn't evolve. Maybe the writers just made the whole thing up. Maybe there really was no historical Jesus. Maybe there's no legend. Maybe the New Testament writers made the entire thing up. How would we answer that?
Well, if you think about it, like, there's really no reason for them to just make it up, because, like you said, they're usually, when people make things up, they're usually looking for a gain, which it could be like money, power, and I think you mentioned one more thing, I can't remember.
It's the thing we can't mention because we're recording this. We could mention it. It's just more fun this way.
Yeah. But all they got was, persecution and martyrdom, and the whole point. You can see like how important the thing that they were writing about is because of the consequences they had to face.
Yep. Who would die? Who would suffer and die for what they knew was a lie?
You also have some external sources outside of the New Testament which make reference to Jesus. So at the very least, you can establish that Jesus was a historical figure and not a fictional one.
Exactly.
We know that the following around him started like when he died and rose, because there's Roman responses to that. So it's not just a few people, it's a large group of people at the time when it happened.
Exactly. And the impact that Jesus had. There's a book by Jim Warner Wallace. Haven't read it yet, want to, but I've got a humongous queue right now called Person of Interest, where he looks at the impact that Jesus of Nazareth has had on art, music, science, governance, so on and so forth. And basically one of the questions asks, like, how? Like, this is a greater influence than any other human has ever had. And yet you want me to believe that a fictional human had more of an impact on world history than any real human. Like, what?
In Acts 4 or 5, Gamaliel in the Sanhedrin sort of makes the same point, and it's like, if this is not from God, then it will fall away.
Mm-hmm.
These movements will fall away, like that of Judas
Yep.
the Galilean or Theudius. And it's like, we don't know anything about these guys other than like passing mentions in Josephus and the mention in Acts, right?
Yep.
But instead, with Christianity, with Jesus, we have an entire 2,000 long tradition that has survived thousands of years. So it's like, they got really, really lucky if they made it up.
Exactly. It's again, the evidence just doesn't support it. And we kind of covered this one already. Maybe the original stories are true, but the manuscripts got corrupted over time. What do we say about that?
It would be the most impressive corruption effort in all of recorded or unrecorded history.
Yeah.
By multiple orders of magnitude.
Mm-hmm. Because again, it's you can't think about it in 21st century where we have instant communication and we have instant access to everything. You would have to hunt down and find every single copy in the Roman Empire and have it destroyed. When again, you're not this big, powerful, centralized church. You are illegal under the Roman government. Like, that's incredibly difficult to believe.
And then see tens of thousands of copies and all through secondary sources.
Mm-hmm.
of different time variances, which they wouldn't have known how to do.
Yep.
It also would have happened, it would have had to have happened very fast.
Yes.
Because by the 2nd century, we have the fathers who are telling basically everything as is recorded in the scriptures. So it had to have happened early, or literally everything, including our manuscript of the fathers, had to have been corrupted in like the 9th century or something.
Yep. And again, the church fathers, it wasn't like they were all in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
They were all over the place. They were in North Africa. They were in they were in Europe. They were all over the place. So again, it wasn't like there was this everything was in one place where you could just get it all in one shot. All right. So maybe the church picked the stuff about Jesus they liked and got rid of the stuff they didn't. Kind of the Dan Brown conspiracy theory that all these things happened at the Council of Nicaea, which is hilarious because we have the minutes of the Council of Nicaea. Like we know how many times people wipe their nose at the Council of Nicaea, and yet somehow this happened without anybody. No. Again, it's if you're going to make conspiracy theories, you've got to have some kind of it's got to be plausible. And especially, it has to be more plausible than the alternative. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. A lot of these conspiracy theories get, they get a lot of oxygen in the internet, but then when you look at them, they fail the plausibility test. This is a much more complex and elaborate explanation of events with many more points of failure than just the simple one of, we actually landed on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions or discussion? Ooh, it's 8:07. Sorry for going over time. Go for it. Yes.
I was gonna ask earlier, but a lot of Bibles say the Gospels are according to Matthew, all of that. What do you think about it? What does that mean?
It just means they're the author. It's just, in other words, there's a gospel, capital G, of the good news of Jesus Christ. And then these are the records of it that were specifically told by these different people from different perspectives. So I wouldn't read a whole lot of... Was there something else you were thinking, if you were concerned about reading into the words according to?
No, not really. I mean, I was thinking, because a lot of people say it's the New Testament authors didn't actually physically write it. It was more scribes that listened to what they said, or scribes that they've listened to but didn't have a connection with the New Testament authors. They just wrote them according to Matthew or Luke. What would you say?
I have not heard the word according to interpreted that way.
Okay.
So I would be reluctant. I mean, certainly there is strong evidence that at least a number of the epistles we have use what the technical term is an amanuensis, which is where you have someone write. Because we know Paul's eyesight was even worse than mine. And we see these things where he says, see what large letters I use when I write to you, which is really hilarious in a typed Bible. I'm it's exactly the same size. Mm-hmm. But, that there's, because sometimes people will bark about, the Greek, the Greek in 2 Peter is different from the Greek in 1 Peter, or the Greek in, Paul's letters is different from this. But in many cases they did have a scribe, and those, sometimes it was something where they still dictated things word for word. Sometimes it was a scribe as somebody who had a little more freedom to inject their own stylistic ticks into these kinds of things. But I don't have a problem. I think the idea of an amanuensis explains a lot of things, but I don't think it threatens at all the idea of, again, eyewitness authorship or eyewitnesses being very intimately involved in it. Because even there, if I'm using a real amanuensis, I'm going to be in the room talking to them and describing what I'm going to do. So it's still coming from me. It's just someone else may have different verbal tics or may be able to express things in a more compact fashion than I can. Does that help, or did I answer the wrong question?
No, that makes sense.
Okay. So I just think of according to in the same way that you have, if you think about it, you could say in a sense that a court testimony is going to be according to, if 4 or 5 of us were, we're on Route 1 and we saw, a head-on accident between 2 cars on Campus Drive, in one sense it'd be the testimony according to Bob, the testimony according to Rahman, the testimony according to, in a certain sense, the same idea. They'd be different perspectives, and there will be differences in our testimony because we have different there are different things that are going to stand out to us. We may have seen it from different angles if we weren't all standing in a group, but we were in different places. There's other parts of it that may make it that may make it different. And that's the other thing with the New Testament documents too, is the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John should just be absolute locked in copies of each other or have every detail exactly the same. That's not how it works. I mean, if anything, in legal terms, when an accident happens or there's something like that, one of the first things that the cops do is to try to separate the witnesses, because they don't want them corroborating with each other. They want the differences in their perspectives, because a lot of times those will give you pieces of that will give you pieces of information you wouldn't have had otherwise. And interestingly, I won't go into it here. I'll do another talk at some point. There's actually instances where there are details in certain gospels that only make sense with information that's provided in another gospel. So I think there's so having 4 sometimes drives you nuts, because there's certain things you're trying to figure out of how to reconcile certain accounts. But on the other hand, also the fact is, nobody felt, and it's another argument to me against biblical alteration, because if what we see as discrepancies in the gospel accounts are such a faith-shattering big deal, why didn't or if the church really had the ability to mess around with the manuscripts, why didn't they clean all this stuff up? Why did they leave it there? This is embarrassing. They could have just cleaned all this stuff up and made all these little inconvenient things disappear into the memory hole, and we wouldn't have known any better. But the fact that they're still there, actually, to me, is very strong evidence for their veracity, and that the record hasn't been tampered with, because this is something I would have been very tempted to, one angel or 2, at the tomb. Is it one demon-possessed guy or 2 at the Gadarenes?
They also actively tried to reconcile these things in their commentaries and homilies.
Yeah, but they never, ever, ever messed with the manuscripts. And I think that's an important, again, there's plenty, there's a lot of other things they should have cleaned. If there really were things that needed to be cleaned up, there's a lot of other things that should have been cleaned up that didn't get cleaned up, which makes me think nothing got cleaned up. And that's good. Other questions? All right. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.